Hi, everybody. Thanks again for tuning in to this episode of the Technical Empowerment Series. My name is Brian Suk, the Associate CTO here for Data Engineering and Analytics, and today we want to talk to you about data and its impact in responsible artificial intelligence. We want to dedicate some time talking about the responsibility aspect of artificial intelligence because we believe that going forward, AI will play only bigger parts in our lives. And so it's very, very important that we make sure that all the advances that we make as a society are both equitable and fair with regards to technology and AI. And with that, we delve into three main areas of responsible AI with regards to data. And the first one is data integrity. We have data curation and data governance as well. With regards to data integrity, we want to make sure that the data itself is going to paint a clear and accurate picture of what we really want the algorithms to train. The decisions that any algorithm will make will be primarily dependent upon the data that it's analyzing, as well as the responses and the feedback that we get going forward after the model is deployed. And such, it is very, very important that when we first design the algorithms and we first train them, that the data that we have do not have any inherent biases in them and as fair and equitable as possible when looking at a representation of where we want to draw the information from. Data curation is also important because when we think about humans picking out what pieces of data that we want to train algorithms on, we have to make sure that we are not inputting our human biases in the selection of the data itself that the algorithms will train on. And lastly, governance is going to be important as well. When we think about the data that we feed the algorithms, that we train it on top of, we want to make sure that we have the best insight as we can possibly get into what we are selecting and how we are curating it. And that can only be possible through robust data governance practices with clear lineage and taxonomies defined, as well as insight into the source data as well. And going forward, when we make recommendations through an algorithm, we want to make sure that we can explain what happened. And so the explainability aspect of it is increasingly crucial as well. And this is important because these are not just things that operate in a computer in isolation on its own. These are all things that have real social impacts. And let me give a few examples of how this manifests itself into the real world. So one example is with recruiting. There was an example of a large company that wanted to leverage machine learning and artificial intelligence to make recommendations on hiring decisions based upon an input resume. And the training data that it used was about 10 years worth of resumes that the company has seen in its past. And with that came information around who was successful and who was hired and who was not. Now, one of the things that came out of this is that the recommendations tend to skew towards men because what ends up happening is that there were inherent biases made by humans in the hiring decisions, which naturally skewed towards men in that particular company. And so when the algorithm started training on the resume data, it made some associations and assumptions thinking that, oh, if I see a male resume, it's probably more successful than not. And if it sees things that says things like women's studies or anything regarding women on the resume, it tended to think that it was not a successful candidate. And we know that as humans, this is absolutely not a true assumption or assessment to make. But because the training data fed off of resumes and it fed off of a curated data set, which had implicit biases inherent to what we fed it, it started itself having these same implicit biases as well. And that's something that we want to avoid going forward. Another example that I want to bring up is in financial services. And there was an example of a tech company and a large bank that got together to try to create a new digital credit card and a new way to issue credit. And as part of the decision process that they implemented included machine learning and AI algorithms as a way to look at more attributes of a person's profile to properly determine credit lines. A retroactive study actually found that women tended to have lower credit lines than men did, and that was something that they did not intentionally do and that we wanted to avoid. And we believe that one of the reasons that this happened is through a concept called proxy biases, in which case we don't explicitly single people out or look for things on ways to necessarily lower credit scores and credit limits. But rather, it's using implicit biases and using proxies for different biases. One example is using residence and neighborhood as a proxy for race. Another is an example, even as innocuous as using a Mac or a PC and using that as a proxy bias for wealth. And so these are things that we want to make sure that we avoid going forward. And it's not necessarily something that we had envisioned going into this journey. But now that we know, we have to make sure that we avoid these kinds of biases in the future. And one more example that I wanted to bring up is in the realm of healthcare. And in 2019, there was a study done after machine learning algorithms were introduced in assisting doctors with the prognoses of patients. And they found that people of color required a higher level of symptoms and essentially needed the patient to be more sick in order to retrieve the same amount of diagnoses and the same amount of care, essentially. And when looking at the data, one of the interesting things that was unintended but discovered is that the training data showed that in the past, there were income disparities and they were affected by the social determinants of health, where the people of color that required higher levels of symptoms quite simply couldn't afford to come back and receive the same amount of care. And because the data shows that the patient didn't return, the algorithms incorrectly determined that they were healthy when in fact they were not. And by looking at this data and making that kind of conclusion, it started making those assumptions going forward. That's another example of biases that were not necessarily intended or we didn't want in there because the data was like that and it was showing that that's what it ultimately came to. And so what do we do going forward? There's no silver bullet per se. There's no magic prescription here to fix all the problems that we're going to encounter. But there are things we can do to maximize our chances that we mitigate as much harm as possible and get as much of an outcome for positive results that we really want in order to unleash the potential of AI to do good in society. And one of them is really to, when you develop an algorithm or if you develop an application, really sit down and be sure to think out as far as you can what the social implications of what you're creating could possibly be. Now, we're never going to really figure out everything in one shot, but the more we think about this and the more we talk about this, I think the greater likelihood we have that we will discover things that we might run into that we can avoid in the beginning in the design phase. Another is around data curation and data governance. Make sure that you have as robust of a governance program as possible when securing your data, when curating it, and when selecting what you want to train your data on. And also when you have reinforcement data coming in after deployment, you want to make sure that you minimize as many biases as you possibly can so we can avoid that going forward. And lastly, representation always matters. When we think about the design of this and we think about how we want to implement and let our AI-based applications go out into the wild, make sure you have people with different viewpoints, different backgrounds, and different experiences in the room. Because one person does not know all the experiences that everyone in the world is going to have, nor can you anticipate how people will interact with it unless you get as many voices as you can in the room. So that way you have more and more people who can occasionally raise their hands and are empowered to say, hey, this might be a problem and we should avoid it. And the more you do that, the less problems we will all have going forward. And those are just some of the thoughts that I had around responsibility and AI and machine learning. And we hope that these are thought-provoking ideas. And ultimately, this is a very, very fluid topic where people have different viewpoints and different opinions. And we absolutely want to engage with you and hear what you have to say on this topic. So please do feel free to comment in the section below. And if you do like what we have to say, please do like and subscribe as well. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you on the next episode.